Welcome to the Film Florida podcast. I'm John Lux, and I'm the Executive Director of Film Florida. Before we get to our interview, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the Film Florida podcast. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please consider going to our website and donating $20.22 for our 2022 fundraising campaign. We also have a Film Florida merchandise page. Visit filmflorida.creator-spring.com to purchase Film Florida t-shirts, sweatshirts, coffee mugs, and more. Frank Pace is a 4-time Emmy-nominated producer and executive producer with more than 700 episodes of network television to his credit. He's produced 16 pilots, 12 of which went to series. His credits include Head of the Class, Suddenly Susan, George Lopez, For Your Love, Shake It Up, Girl Meets World, and Murphy Brown, just to name a few. Frank currently hosts his own podcast and is a graduate of Jacksonville University. Here's my conversation with Frank Pace. Welcome to the Film Florida podcast, Frank.
Thank you, sir. My pleasure to be here.
So tell us a little bit about your backstory. Where did you come from?
I came from a little place in New York called Valhalla. I went to Valhalla High School. We were called the Vikings, and I had pretty much of an idyllic youth.
And then after high school, you found your way to Jacksonville University. It seems kind of an interesting trek from upstate New York down to Jacksonville. Tell us why you went to college there and what your college life was like.
Well, I went to college there because I was looking for a business program. I was looking for a soccer program. I had pretty much gotten rid of any thoughts of playing baseball. And I was really looking for the warm weather.
Okay.
And I had to pay for my own education. So JU afforded me the ability to pay for my own education as well.
Now, is that where you found your interest in film and television?
No, I didn't know what I was going to do. For many, many years after that, I sort of found my way into television by accident.
Oh, really?
And I guess I've just walked through every door that opened up opportunity-wise. I heard it knocking and I walked through it, and it just led me to my career.
So did you have an interest before you went out to California, or did you find your way out there and stumbled into it?
I found my way out here and stumbled into it. I played soccer and baseball, as I said, in college. And I sort of wanted to go into sports. And I moved out here with the idea of going in sports. Actually, it's a long story that I'll try to abbreviate, but I was interested in university admissions, hotel management, and sports. I graduated from Jacksonville in December of 72.
Okay.
And in January of 73, I had a job interview in Fort Wayne, Indiana for Indiana Institute of Technology admissions assistant. I went to that, and I was walking around at night after the meeting. There was a bank thermometer up there that said -4 degrees. The snow was backlit. And I said, what the hell am I doing in Fort Wayne? I had to fly back to either expecting to go to New York through Chicago, of all places. Mm-hmm. And I went to look at the board, and there was a flight in 5 hours to New York and a flight in 1 hour to Los Angeles. So I got on a Los Angeles flight rather than waiting the extra time to go back to New York.
So what did you do when you got to California?
Well, my best friend from high school was a first-year medical student at UCLA. So I knew I had a place to stay. And I slept on his couch for about a month or so. And then I got a job at the May Company, of all places, as a head of stock, as a management trainee, head of stock, which paid the $600 a month, not a week, a month.
So how did you get from there to television production?
Well, I still was aspiring for a career in sports.
Uh-huh.
So I wrote everybody I could letters. I wrote letters after letters after letters after letters, begging for an opportunity to work in sports. And then finally, I remember I went to see a man by the name of Dennis Murphy, who founded the ABA with Gary Davidson, the NBA, the ABA, and the World Hockey Association.
Okay.
And he was the president of the Los Angeles team. I think it was the Sharks. And he sat down and had a meeting with me. And I sort of channeled my inner Muhammad Ali. And he said, "Why should I hire you?" And I said, "You should hire me because I'm going to work very cheap. The next time you interview me, it's going to cost you a lot of money." And he liked that. And he recommended me to a guy by the name of Fred Curly Morrison, who had been a great running back at Ohio State, MVP of the 1954, maybe, Rose Bowl, who was the general manager of the Southern California Sun in the fledgling World Football League. Okay. He said, "Why don't you go see Curly?" So I went to see Fred and Curly Morrison, and he hired me for 30 days to work for free. I said, "You can hire me for 30 days. At the end of 30 days, either pay me or we'll say goodbye." And he liked me. But as fate would have it, he hired another PR guy. I wasn't able to handle a Los Angeles PR at that time, and the PR guy wanted to let me go. But Curly said, "You're a great worker, so I'm going to recommend you to Bruce Gelker, who's the owner of the Portland team."
Okay.
So I went down, met with Bruce Gelker, and he hired me. And 24 hours later, I was in Portland, working for the Portland Storm. And that sort of led to a 2-year journey in sports. I decided then that I wanted to get out of sports. I forgot to mention early on while I was working at the May Company, I appeared on a show called Split Second, which aired right after Jeopardy. And I was a 2-time champion. And I was enamored. I remember being enamored with the lights and the activities and the goings on stage. And I said, "Wow, too bad I couldn't make my career doing something like this." And then I moved on because I was still trying to get a career in sports. After 2 years in the World Football League, the World Football League folded, and I went to Chicago in the second year of the World Football League. I met a lot of great people in Chicago. Les Grobstein, who was with the Bulls at the time, who you might know as a Chicago native.
Yeah.
Jim Durham, all of those guys were working for the Chicago Winds at the time, and I really liked them. But I didn't like the prospects of working in a sport where the owner at a whim could fire you. Mm-hmm. And, Babe Pirelli was our head coach. After 2 exhibition games, he got fired by Gene Polano, and Polano brought in Abe Gibran to be the head coach. And I remember we had 4 assistant coaches at the time, and one by one, the first 3 went in to Abe Gibran and they resigned. And the 4th one, I heard him calling out the signals: hut, 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 blue 37, green 38. And I said, "Jesus Christ, is that what I have to do is to keep a job?" And he kept his job. I said, "This is all wrong for me." So I started a career in advertising. And I went to San Diego to work in advertising, and I worked there for 8 years. During that time, I was able to really make some contacts with a lot of great people. I built the PR department from a $12,000 department into a $3 million capitalized billing within 7 years. And I got national accounts like Pony Shoes of New York. And I started to get into cross promotions, doing promotions with companies like Echelon was partnered with Pony. Echelon was my first account. We partnered up with Pony. We did a national racquetball series. And then later on, Speedo Swimwear partnered up with Anheuser-Busch and created a national racquetball, a national triathlon short course championships. And during that time, a man called me up. I was trying to get racquetball on television. a man by the name of Bill Rasmussen called me up and he said, "Hey, I heard you trying to get racquetball on TV." I said, "Yes, sir, I am." He said, "Well, can I come out and see you?" And I said, "Yes, sir, you sure can." I didn't know what he was going to see me about.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he walked into my office in San Diego, he said, "I'm starting a new network. It's going to be called the Entertainment and Sports Programming Network, ESPN.
Yeah.
If you produce a racquetball show, I'll air it." And I did. I produced a racquetball show, and I cut my teeth on that. I mean, can you imagine this man who was going to start a sports network that became ESPN, making a trip out to see me from Connecticut at my office in San Diego to beg me to put a racquetball on the program, on TV. So the two sponsors, Echelon and Perrier at that time, gave me $25,000 to produce a television show. And I produced the show, and it ran for like 6 years on ESPN. And then Speedo came to me and said, "Can you do the same thing for short course triathlon?" ABC Wild World of Sports had just aired the triathlon, and Julie Moss had staggered across the finish line in a very famous scene. And everybody was talking about racquetball. So we did that, and that led to me getting more experience in show business. So then I sort of pioneered product placement, because Pony Athletic Shoes came to me and said, "Can you put our show on television?" So I started going to Hollywood to give away shoes to anybody who would take them. And ourselves and Nike were the only one that was doing it. So we were in a constant battle with Nike. Pony obviously lost the bigger battle with Nike.
Right.
It was a good battle in the early 80s. And I then went to go see a man by the name of Abby Singer, who's the legendary production manager in show business. And he was producing a show called Bay City Blues, which would be Steven Bochco's follow-up to Hill Street Blues.
Okay.
It was going to star Ken Olin, Sharon Stone, Michael Nouri, Dennis Franz, Bernie Casey, and on and on and on. And I was going to give him everything for free. I would give him shoes for free, uniforms for free, everything. And he happened to say to me, "Would you know anybody who's available to be a technical advisor for this show?" And I said, "Yeah, I played baseball in college. I'll be more than happy to be a technical advisor." So that's how I got my break into show business, through Abby Singer.
Wow. That's quite a way.
Circuitous route.
Yes, absolutely. Well, and then when I did my research, it looks like your first long-term projects where you were an associate producer, then line producer, and then producer was Head of the Class, which is a great show. How did that series lay the foundation for the next 35 years of your career?
Well, again, I got really lucky. And anybody who says they're in this business and doesn't attribute part of their success to luck is crazy and a liar.
Yep.
So I came up in 1984. I had just got married and I wanted to try to make a career in show business. I gave up a good $75,000 a year job, which in 84 was a lot of money to me. It's actually, a decent amount of money now.
Mm-hmm.
And I tried to get into show business. I did a movie as an associate producer called A Winner Never Quits, which is the story of Pete Gray, the one-arm outfielder. And Keith Carradine played Pete Gray. Ed O'Neill was in it. Ed played his brother. Dennis Weaver played his dad. Fanula Flanagan played his mom, and Mayor Winningham played his love interest. Okay. And we shot that in Memphis, Tennessee. And I decided that was not, single camera was not the life for me, because we often work 12, 14-hour days on location, and you're constantly looking for your next job. So I wanted to set my sights on situation comedies. And I was doing commercials in the interim to pay the bills. I went from $75,000 to $12,000 the next year, but I was convinced I was going to make something of myself. One of the fellas I met in the World Football League was a fella by the name of Stu Barber. And Stu was our offensive line coach who left when Abe Gibran came in. Stu went on to become the general manager of the Buffalo Bills. The Buffalo Bills food services were run by a man by the name of Joe Simon, who was the head of Service Systems Corporation. Stu had another friend by the name of Steve Papazian, who was the head of food services at Warner Brothers Commissary.
Okay.
So Stu invited Steve Papazian and Joe Simon down to San Diego to a college football all-star game that I was running with my assistant, who was Armin Katayan, who went on to become
huge.
Yep. And we were running this football game. Stu came with Joe Simon and Steve Papazian, and that's how I met Steve Papazian, who ultimately became the president of Warner Brothers Feature Films.
Mm.
But Steve in 1986 wanted me to interview for a show that they had where they were going to fire the associate producer, called Growing Pains on ABC.
Yeah.
I met with him. I met with the executive producer. That didn't go well. Steve said, wait, I have another show coming up. From there, I waited 4 weeks, and Steve set me up to meet as associate producer on Head of the Class. I met with this woman who will remain nameless. I didn't get the job. And Steve said, wait, this isn't over. 2 weeks later, he called me again, and he said, I want you to interview with the executive producers. And the executive producers hired me. At the end of the year, I asked why she didn't hire me. She said, because it was obvious you would take my job after the first year. And that's what happened. I took her job. And then after a half a year as an associate producer, or 3/4 of a season as associate producer, I took her job as producer.
Wow.
That said, again, luck comes into it, because Head of the Class was picked up for 13 episodes. We got it back 9, so we did 22 that season. After season 1, we got picked up for a season 2. After season 2, we got picked up for 2 years for seasons 3 and 4. Had we got canceled after 13 episodes, I would have been out of my behind, and I wouldn't have had a chance to produce Murphy Brown pilot in 1991, because that was a Warner Brothers show. After 2 years of that, Steve felt comfortable enough in my work to recommend me to Diane English to produce Murphy Brown. And also in 1991, I produced the Babe Ruth movie starring Stephen Lang. So neither of those two milestones in my career would not have happened if Head of the Class had not been picked up for year 1 and year 2. 1988 was the year that we did Murphy Brown. 1991, we did Babe Ruth, but also 1991, Head of the Class became the first show ever to shoot in Russia. And we shot 2 shows in Russia over monumental odds. So that's how I established a reputation as a guy who could get it done.
People often ask me like advice for getting into the career and getting into the industry, and best advice. My best advice that I always give people is actually exactly how my career has gone: is be at the right place at the right time, and then don't screw it up. That's the best thing, the best advice you can give anybody. And so I'm glad that you followed similar advice.
Yeah, because in this career, there are bullets flying all over the place. Everybody's out to get you. So you've got to successfully dodge those bullets in order to succeed. And the Growing Pains guy didn't want me. The Head of the Class person didn't want me. But I didn't dodge those bullets. But fortunately, Steve Papazian, who was in a position of power, not as much power as he would ultimately have, who was the decision maker, decided that I was the guy that could get it done.
Well, and then Frank, as I look through your career, based on your credits from 1986 until 2020, you were working on something at almost all times, which is unusual. Some series were longer runs than others, but you had things like Suddenly Susan, For Your Love, George Lopez, Shake It Up, Girl Meets World, and just to name a few. Most people are lucky to get one or two of those, and you've had a number of those in your career. Other than being lucky, what do you attribute that success to?
Well, I think success can come from delivering, knowing how to manage people, knowing my strengths, knowing what I can't do. And, Ben Hogan always said the secret's in the dirt of his golf swing. How did he succeed at golf? He said the secret's in the dirt. You have to practice, practice, practice. Well, I love to work, and I still do. I'm currently supervising Night Court at Warner Brothers. Mm-hmm. I'm supervising Call Me Kat at Warner Brothers. So I'm still very active in my career. And again, it's knowing what's expected of me and doing more.
That's actually excellent advice. So over the last 35 years, is there a favorite project that you have, or are they like kids where you love them all the same?
Well, I do love them all the same, some more than others. But I think that if I had to pick one show to do for the rest of my life, it would be a show that you didn't even name called Daddy Dearest, starring Don Rickles and Richard Lewis.
Okay.
Because during that time, Don and I became very, very close friends. Don always says that for two guys to be friends, their wives have got to get along. My wife, Karen, and his wife, Barbara, got along famously. And Don adored me, and I could make Don laugh. And for 13 episodes, over 16 weeks, I had the greatest job anybody could ever have. We had guest stars like Frank Sinatra appear on the show, Angie Dickinson, Adrienne Barbeau, Alex Rocca from Godfather. All of Don's friends showed up to be on the show. And it was a hilarious show, which starred Don and Richard Lewis. Unfortunately, Don was supposed to be in 2 out of the 5 scenes for comic relief. In order to make the show succeed, Billy Van Zandt and Jane Milmore, the writers, had to give Don more to do than he wanted to do. And Don was, not the most politically correct person, even then. Mm-hmm. And he alienated a lot of people. And the show was not a success, but it was the best job I ever had.
That's great. That's a great story. So a lot has changed in the industry since you started. In your opinion, what's the most positive change that's happened, as well as the negative that has changed in the industry?
Well, I think the changes are just evolutionary.
Mm-hmm.
As the market and society evolves, so does our business. And the business was always run by money. That's why they call it show business rather than show art. Mm-hmm. But the business was always run by money. However, it's all run by businessmen now. There is not a Jack Warner alive anymore. There's not a Daryl F. Zanuck alive anymore. There's not a showman who makes his living in show business. They're all business people. So a show like Cheers would never survive past their ratings the first year. A show like Seinfeld would never have made it to become the hit, because Seinfeld was on 4 episodes and then it was on like maybe 9 episodes the second season. Mm-hmm. A show like St. Elsewhere had dreadful ratings, but because Brandon Tartikoff at NBC had faith, he could give it a second year, or in the case of a Seinfeld, he can give it a third year. And it takes time for shows to evolve, and shows no longer get the chance to evolve. And that's the biggest difference. Again, everything is evolutionary. They just can't afford to give shows the time to evolve that they need. They either have to hit immediately or they're gone.
That's a great point. I've often commented that, I really like a show, but I know it's not going to get a second season because the ratings aren't good enough. And you're right. Shows don't get a chance to continue, which is really sad, because you're right. A lot of the greatest shows ever, you look back and part of their great story is the fact that they struggled their first season or even their first or second season and then all of a sudden found their legs. Yeah, that's a great point. Frank, you also produced a documentary about Jacksonville University called Jackson Who. Tell us about that.
Well, Jacksonville Who was a labor of love for me. Another JU alum had approached me about doing a movie about it. And I said, there's nobody interested in a feature film about Jacksonville University, because Texas Western, who is now Texas El Paso, in 1986, won a national championship starting 5 Black players 4 years prior to what we did at Jacksonville with Artis Gilmore, Pembroke Burrows, Vaughn Wedeking, Rex Morgan. And I thought about it, and I thought it could be a documentary because of the impact that the JU team had on the city of Jacksonville. Jacksonville was a segregated city. Up until 1968, they had segregated schools. They didn't even have mixed race schools. And they didn't have any Black athletes for the most part in Florida. There was only one Black athlete in the entire SEC in 1970. Mm-hmm. So I guess the Beatles sort of broke the segregation thing a little bit in 1964 when they performed a concert in the Gator Bowl. And they read that they had segregated stands, a white section for the population, one population, and the Black people had to sit in another segment of the stands. Paul McCartney said he refused to come to Jacksonville if they couldn't be integrated. And the Gator Bowl rewrote their contract, and they had integrated stands, and the people were integrated. And remember, in 1960, they had the axe handle incident. And as I started putting this together and knowing that the Sheriff Nat Glover was still alive, I knew I could have interviews with them. And moving forward, when Artis and the basketball team started having success, they kickstarted integration, full-scale integration in the city of Jacksonville, because that basketball team was considered Jacksonville's team. And for the white population in Jacksonville to call primarily Black stars their team was a major focus. So that's what I decided to do. And a lot of the guys that started dying from that Jacksonville team. And since that time, 2 more players have passed away. So I wanted to get the real story of what that Jacksonville team accomplished and how they accomplished it and the impact they had on the city. Well, a proportionate of the players were still alive. And since I've done that interview, Mayor Tommy Hazouri has passed away. My good friend Jay Thomas, who was at Jacksonville with me and became an Emmy Award-winning actor, passed away, and 2 of the players have passed away. So it was actually past time for me to have done it, but the right time for me in my career to do it.
It's a really underrated story. I mean, as I did a little bit of research, I didn't know half of the things that you just outlined until I read a little bit more up on it. Where can people find the documentary?
It aired on the NBA Network in 2018 as a part of Martin Luther King Month. After trying to sell it to a syndication, I finally decided to let people see it. So we put it on YouTube. So if your audience wants to go on YouTube, the YouTube channel, and just Google search Jacksonville Who with a question mark, they can see it for free. It's a 60-minute film, and it'll be well worth your time.
That's great. Now, Frank, you also have a podcast. What's the name of it and where can people find it?
It's called a Mick, M-I-C-K, a Mook, M-O-O-K, and a Mike, M-I-C. And anybody who's on Facebook can find it. Anybody who's on Spotify can find it. Anybody who's on YouTube can find it just by punching in a Mick, a Mook, and a Mike. And it's a weekly podcast. We've done over 100 episodes. We've had people like astronaut David Scott, who was the first man to drive on the moon, who lives in Jacksonville with his wife, Meg. We've had Artis Gilmore on. We've got John LaRoquette's coming on. We have Kenny Anderson coming on. We've had so many wonderful guests. Leslie Visser's on, this famous sportscaster. Armin Katayan's on. So many terrific. Rod Carew, who I've represented for 40 years, has been a guest. Artis Gilmore, as I mentioned, has been a guest. We have a lot of fun with it. It usually runs an hour and 15 minutes. And Billy's a great guy because Billy was recently voted by Podcast Magazine one of the top 40, over 40 members of podcasters in the nation. And he's a tremendous story. He was a firefighter in New York for 20 years. He was a first responder, a Vietnam vet, all the while being a cocaine addict and a drug addict and an alcoholic and an illegal bookmaker. At 58 years old, he decided to put the plug in the jug, as he likes to say, enrolled at the University of Florida, and at 62, graduated with a degree in journalism. He's a remarkable story. He's been sober ever since he enrolled at University of Florida, and he's one of the funniest men you'll ever meet. And I invite everybody to look for our podcast, a Mick, a Mook, and a Mike. It's really funny.
Yeah, I've checked out a few episodes. It is very entertaining. Yeah, it's you guys have a great time, which is fun. Now, we've talked throughout about a couple pieces of advice that you have, which is, be lucky and then overproduce. Last question here. I mean, is there anything kind of big picture that you want to share with the audience, either advice or where you think the industry is going? Any last bits of knowledge you want to share?
Well, yeah, for youngsters trying to get into business, it's much easier to get into business now than when I was coming up. Because when I was coming up, you had to know somebody, or you had to really, really do something extraordinary to be noticed. Now, if you're a writer, if you're a director, if you're an editor, if you're all of those things, you can simply do it all on your cell phone. Make a movie. Mm-hmm. If you're a writer, pair up with somebody who's a director. If you're going to film school, pair up with somebody who's an editor. You can do everything. You can do demos on YouTube. Intellectual property is terrific. If you have your own IP, that's great. Put it on internet. Put it on YouTube. Put it on Twitter. Put it on TikTok. All of those are great avenues to be noticed. Secondarily, if you're in Florida, get out of Florida. Go to New York. Go to Los Angeles, because it's just as hard to get a job in Florida as it is to get a job in Los Angeles. So you might as well get a job that can lead to something, as opposed to a job in Florida that can lead to a bigger market. You can build your reputation faster in a place like Los Angeles or New York or Nashville, if you want to get into music, than you can in a place like Florida, which doesn't have any incentives for production. Right. And the film incentives are critical. And I don't know what DeSantis is doing, or I don't know what people in Florida are doing by not having incentives, because incentives can add so much money to the state treasury. It's staggering to think how much money is being left on the table by a state like Florida, whereby Jacksonville was the original Hollywood. Right. It was the original Hollywood back in 1900s, because you can get there from New York. Whereas California was the second alternative, it became an alternative to Florida when the people of Jacksonville drove Hollywood out of Florida because of the fires.
Right. That is part of the history. Yep.
That's part of the history. And that's how Los Angeles became Los Angeles, because luck. If they didn't have the luck, Jacksonville would have been Hollywood. Jacksonville very well might have been Hollywood because the locations are perfect for so many movies. You've got the beach, you've got the forest, you've got so many things available in Jacksonville. I have tried for years to shoot in Florida, and I just can't get the incentives. You can talk more about that than me because you're there.
Right.
You're living through that hell.
We certainly are. And I mean, as you know, from our conversations with our good friend Todd Rubin, there's a number of locations in Florida that have local incentives. They're much smaller, obviously. Admittedly, it's very difficult to compete with the larger incentives with those. But that's what we have right now. And that's what we're trying to make the most of, which certainly makes it very difficult to get major television series, major feature films. We continue to work. Our organization, as you know, Film Florida works really hard to try and get those programs back at a state level. And I'm cautiously optimistic we're going to get there. Don't ask me when, because that's the important question. I think we're going to get there because you're right. We are leaving literally hundreds of millions of dollars on the table every single year. We're continuing to lose our great college graduates that come out of great schools here in the state and go elsewhere. Your advice to get people to leave the state to get better jobs, unfortunately, is a lot of times accurate. And as much as we hate to hear it, we don't want to hear that. We want those jobs to stay here, to keep the infrastructure here, to keep the history here. We know we have the locations and the weather to our advantage, but we need to make it, you said it earlier, this is a business. And businesses go where they get the best value for their dollar. And unfortunately, that isn't right now for those major pictures, the larger television series and feature films.
Yeah, I'm afraid Florida is going to miss the bubble too, because right now with streaming services going through the roof, budgets are increasing incrementally. And Warner Brothers Television now does budgets $10 and $12 million per episode. Mm-hmm. I mean, over the course of 10 episodes streaming, that's $120 million. Those shows or those vehicles are going to Vancouver, are going to Toronto, are going to Atlanta, are going to London, are going to Australia. Are going to New Orleans, are going to Oregon. Oregon's just installed a 25% tax incentive. You've got to have that to compete. Yeah. Florida's got so much going for it with no personal income tax,
right?
And realistic for Southern Californians,
right?
You could. I just can't believe that for so long the state of Florida has left the incentive money on the table.
Well, from your lips to God's ears, Frank, we hope we're going to get there, and we look back and this is just a blip, but. You are correct that we need it to compete on a major level, and we're working every day to do it. And your knowledge is invaluable on us needing to get there. So, this has been great. I've thoroughly enjoyed the stories.
I want to mention before you go, you said my lips. That's also the title of a book I wrote called If These Lips Could Talk. I wrote it with Billy O'Connor, my partner. It's available on Amazon. It's sort of my memoir up until 2018 when it came, or 2019 when it came out. But it's got a lot of advice on people I've worked with, people I've met, problems I've encountered, life and death stories. I think it's a really good read. It's available on Amazon. So if you go to Amazon and punch in If These Lips Could Talk, it'll come up. And I really would tell any aspiring film student to read that book, because I think they'll get a lot out of it.
I'm glad you brought that up. I remember reading about that in my research, and I forgot to ask. So I am glad you brought that up, because I plan on purchasing the book myself. So,
and with football season upon us, and with 9/11 upon us, Billy and I have also written a book called Lamar's Gamble. It's a football book. It's the tale of the AFL-NFL merger. So I'm sure football fans will be interested in that. Yep. And a book called Combustible. It's a story of a fireman's road to hell, which meets a detour at 9/11. It's loosely based on Billy's experiences as a 9/11 first responder and his 20-year experience as a fighter fire. So I'm sure that anybody who's looking for a good read can pick up those books. And I think they're enjoyable. We really think they're enjoyable, because if they were crap, we wouldn't put them out.
Give me the names of those books again.
Okay, the first one is If These Lips Could Talk. It's available on Amazon. Okay. Lamar's Gamble, which is a tale of the AFL-NFL merger, also available on Amazon. And Combustible, A Fireman's Road to Hell. It's a detour at 9/11. And they're topical. All three books are topical at this time of the year.
Yes, they are. Well, I appreciate you sharing all of that with us, sharing all of your stories with us. Thank you for your loyalty to the Jacksonville area. We certainly appreciate that here in Florida. For those that are listening here, Frank's wearing a Jacksonville University hat, which is great. But I really appreciate you spending time with us today on the Film Florida podcast, Frank.
Yeah, and Jacksonville is like a second home to me. I go to JU as anytime I can. I've got good friends, Tim Koss, who's the president, Chris Epienza, who's the provost, Artis Gilmore, who's Artis Gilmore. I served on the board of trustees for 10 years. It's a place that I love. I was very close to, well, Jake Thomas was my best friend. Alex Mihalovich is a very, very good friend who's the soccer coach. I'm blessed to have been a student at Jacksonville University.
That's great. Thanks for spending time with us today, Frank.
Thank you, my friend. Be well.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Film Florida podcast. For more information about Film Florida, go to filmflorida.org or visit our social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you're not already a member of Film Florida, please consider joining at filmflorida.org. If you like what you hear on the podcast, please consider going to our website and donating $20.22 for our 2022 fundraising campaign. Check out the Film Florida merchandise at filmflorida.creator-spring.com, and please remember to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast.